Well, you guys know how it is. You can't have one GPU launch without another GPU launch right after it. Jay's out of the office today, but he didn't want to feel left out with this launch, so he went ahead and vomited all of his thoughts into my email inbox. So I get to present that to you guys today, along with what's new with AMD. So let's check it out.
We interrupt this video to bring you a special message from iFixit. No, we interrupt this interruption with this interruption about new stuff from iFixit. Wish you had a new graphics card, but inventory sucks? Fix the inventory problems with iFixit. Whoa, don't drop it. Can't fix that with iFixit. Just kidding, yes you can. Wish you could take iFixit with you anywhere, but your pockets aren't big enough? Introducing the new More
and the new Minnow.
Take them with you anywhere. So get iFixit for your loved ones, or just get them for yourself.
Okay, so the important stuff. AMD is launching their Radeon RX 7600 XT 16GB GPU. It'll be out on January 24th with an MSRP of $329. So let's see how it stacks up to the RX 7600 that it's complementing. As far as specs are concerned, it's got 16GB of VRAM this time around instead of 8 on the 7600. It's got the same amount of compute units, ray accelerators, AI accelerators, and stream processors as the RX 7600. However, the 7600 XT has a 220 MHz game clock uplift and a 100 MHz boost clock uplift. So that's where they're getting the extra performance there. Is they're clocking the same amount of cores, but they're clocking it higher. And the last meaningful change is probably the TDP. It's up to 190 watts now instead of 165 as we see on the 7600. Besides that, everything's pretty much the same as the 7600. It's got 18 gigabits a second memory speed, it's got 128-bit memory bus, and 32 megabytes of AMD Infinity Cache. So since I pretty much agreed with everything Jay sent me, let's get into his 2 cents. Jay says, it's nice to see more entry-level cards receiving higher amounts of VRAM. Despite the limiting factor being the horsepower, not really the VRAM, everyone's been demanding more VRAM, and now both GPU companies are delivering. I don't like that they're using 16 gigabytes to claim future ready, and yes, I agree with Jay here. There is no such thing as truly future ready or future proof. The stream processors will be the ultimate limiting factor in future titles, not really the VRAM. Okay, so in these other benchmarks that AMD showed in their press deck, I thought it was a little interesting because they're comparing it against the 4060 now instead of the 2060. I think this is a comparison between their feature suites, AMD versus NVIDIA, because on the RTX 4060, there are benchmarks in which they enable DLSS 3 and DLSS 3's frame gen. And that's probably because AMD is now launching AMD Fluid Motion Frames, or AFMF, or their version of frame gen, basically. I'll talk about this a little later, but the interesting thing about AFMF is that it's on a driver level and will apply to any DirectX 11 or 12 game. And that goes for RX 6000 series and up owners, not just the 7600 XT or the 7000 series, which is kind of crazy. Anyway, going back to these benchmarks, AMD's software and feature suite is called HyperRX, and that's basically just a one-stop, like, single-click, enable all the AMD performance-enhancing stuff that they have. So HyperRX is automatically going to enable FSR in the game if it supports it. If it doesn't support it, it will enable RSR, which is a driver-level FSR, and lower your resolution 1 tick, equivalent of FSR quality, basically. And then it'll enable anti-lag as well as Radeon Boost in games that support Radeon Boost. Radeon Boost is kind of interesting because it's a motion-based dynamic resolution system. So when you move the mouse, crazy crap is happening on screen. The resolution drops during those frames because usually they're more demanding, and also during quick motion, you're not really paying attention to all the fine details because a bunch of crap is going crazy on the screen. So earlier I was talking about how AMD Fluid Motion Frames is enableable across any DirectX 11 or 12 title, which means you're adding frame gen to games that don't support it. So that's why you see in Baldur's Gate 3 and Assassin's Creed Mirage and The Last of Us, the 4060 does not support DLSS 3 frame gen in any of these titles. However, since you can enable AMD Fluid Motion Frames across the driver, they go ahead and show you the performance uplift you get from here. This is their 1440p benchmark chart. Same thing, they've enabled as many features as they can based on the game support. In fact, if you look here at Like a Dragon Gaiden, the man who erased his name, they even ran FSR and AFMF on the NVIDIA card to give it 150 FPS, up from its native performance of 67 FPS. Now, Jay says it's a little weird because HyperRX does have some special sauce for when you pair an AMD GPU with an AMD CPU. He says he would have liked to have seen the tests with also an Intel or non-AMD CPU basically to see if there's that much of a difference between the special stuff that HyperRX gives you when you pair an AMD GPU and an AMD CPU. So let's start wrapping this up with pricing. Again, it's $329 MSRP, and the 7600 does not change. It's gonna be starting at $269 like it always is. Jay chimed in with some thoughts about the pricing. He says that it would have been nice to have seen a price drop on the 7600, maybe down to $250 and then slide the XT in above it at $300. This would have been a more aggressive move that could have undermined NVIDIA a little. However, the $329 price point does make it more expensive than the still available 3060 and more expensive than the 4060 as well. Jay goes on to say, this will be an exciting time for the $300 to $350 price shopping consumer, but also a bit of a confusing one because both cards, the 4060 that they're comparing it to and the 7600 XT, have different AI and feature suites and all that sort of stuff that you definitely need to enable to get the maximum performance out of either of these cards. Since both cards rely so heavily on their AI and feature sets and all that sort of stuff to get their high frame rates, they might be different, very different end user experiences, even though you might have a card that's getting more FPS than the other one. I personally think that AFMF being a driver level feature on AMD where you can enable it on any game, you don't really have to wait for the developers to implement FrameGen, is an ace up AMD's sleeve. Especially with how much NVIDIA is touting FrameGen these days. The fact that AMD was basically just like, okay, fine, here, FrameGen everything, whatever, you can have fun. I think that's pretty crazy. But what do you guys think of the RX 7600 XT? If you're in the $300 to $350 price range, are you gonna be shopping AMD, NVIDIA? Are you just gonna be waiting and seeing, maybe Intel, to see if they come up with anything new? Sound off down in the comments below, and as always, we will see you guys in the next one.